Of the many remakes, reboots, and sequels that studios have greenlit to feed their ever-hungry streaming services, I'd hoped at the very least that Legend of the Seeker would be one of them. Time and again, we see studios funneling money into projects that everyone and their mothers can already predict will fail. These films and shows, with their shallow scripts and uninspired concepts, barely make a dent in the streaming market or the box office. Yet somehow, the idea of reviving Legend of the Seeker, a series with a passionate fan base and untapped storytelling potential, has been overlooked. For those who haven't heard of the show, my question is, where the hell were you in 2008? That's a stupid question. The Seeker seemed to come out of nowhere, yet its brief run, it managed to captivate millions of fans worldwide. It was more than a show, it was an escape, something people deeply needed during that time. Unfortunately, Disney pulled the plug after only 2 seasons, leaving behind heartbreak, disappointment, and countless unanswered questions. Fans were left stunned. Why would a studio cancel a series that was doing well? Of course, as always, there were behind-the-scenes drama, and we will get into that moment. Trust me. But first, let's talk about why the show mattered. The the Seeker may have not had high art or groundbreaking cinema, but it was good. Better than good. It was well written, engaging, and crafted with sincerity. The characters, the world, and even the villains were presented in such a straightforward, accessible way that anyone could grasp its premise, yet it never felt dumbed down. Its ratings were strong, its fandom was vocal, and the chemistry between the cast was undeniable. Every actor fit their role like a glove, bringing depth to their characters and breathing life into Terry Goodkind's vision. The biggest frustration for fans was that the cancellation came way too soon. The story was based on Terry Goodkind's beloved Sword of Truth series, a sweeping saga that the author dedicated most of his life to writing. By the time the show ended, only a small fraction of material had been used. There were still countless arcs, characters, and conflicts that remained unexplored. The potential for more seasons was enormous, and that's why its abrupt ending felt so cruel. Now let's dig into the plot itself to understand its appeal. At its core, Legend of the Seeker follows the adventures of Richard Cypher, the Seeker of Truth, who is destined to stand against evil and restore balance. He is accompanied by Callan Amnel, the Mother Confessor, Zadikias Zal Zoranda, a powerful wizard. Each episode sends them into deeper, dangerous world, ruled by Daken Rahi, the primary villain of the saga. What made the trio so compelling was not just their quest, but their dynamic as a group. Each of them wielded unique abilities that elevated the stakes of every encounter. The Seeker carried the Sword of Truth, a weapon that in anyone else's hands was merely a blade, but in Richard's, it became a force capable of striking down even the most powerful foes. Kellan's powers were equally fascinating. As a confessor, she could bend the will of any person, forcing them into absolute obedience. It sounds simple on paper, but the way the show executed her abilities, combined with her inner struggles, made her one of the most layered characters. And then there was Zed, the wizard. His repertoire included fireballs, telekinesis, wisdom, and from centuries of experience. He was equal parts comic relief, mentor, warrior, making him indispensable to the group. Over the course of its episodes, the series introduced not just battles but lessons. Villains overpowered the heroes, leaving them scared, challenged, and forced to grow. These moments weren't just a spectacle. They reinforced values like friendship, loyalty, trust, and even the meaning of love. Along the way, new allies joined their journey. None more iconic than Kara Mason, a mod Sith warrior whose addition gave the group unexpected but perfect balance. Together, they didn't just form a team, they became a family. I am not saying that the film is perfect by any stretch of imagination, and it's easy to see why many viewers eventually lost interest. The biggest issue with the show was its failure to adapt or evolve. Almost 95% of the episodes began and ended in the same exact way, following a formula that became stale very quickly. While the heroes always pursued their central goal, the structure of each episode rarely changed. Typically, the characters will start off joking around, sharing light-hearted banter, or indulging in a romantic scene. Then, as the story reached its midpoint, some kind of trouble or danger will inevitably rise. By the end, everything was resolved neatly, only for the same exact structure to repeat itself in the next following episode. This repetitiveness drained the show of much-needed tension and suspense. It was never engaging enough to keep the audiences on the edge of their seats. Characters rarely grew or changed in meaningful ways. Lessons were hardly ever learned, and the emotional arcs felt static. The story leaned heavily on subplots, far too many of them. While subplots can sometimes enrich a series, in this case, they dragged the story down. Instead of weaving seamlessly into the main narrative, they felt like filter distractions that led to nowhere. Audiences tuned in because they wanted to see the heroes face the primary villain, Dark and Rahi, yet the series often forced viewers to slog through meaningless diversions before returning to the central storyline. It felt manipulative, as if the audience were being strung along in anticipation of something grand that never quite arrived. The fight scenes only made things worse. They were painfully repetitive, to the point where viewers could easily predict every single move the characters were about to make. Sword fights dominated nearly every battle, but instead of being thrilling or intense, it became monotonous. To make matters worse, the camera work was clumsy, often making the action appear awkward and less impactful. It became clear that Sam Raimi, the producer of the show, had little idea on how to stage or direct action sequences in a way that felt original, dynamic, or visually exciting. Audiences expect action to evolve, to surprise them with new strategies, styles, or stakes. Instead, the show fell back on the same tired tricks. While there were occasional exceptions, scenes that stood out and hinted at what the show could have achieved, there were too few and far between to alter the overall perception. The villains unfortunately suffered from the same lack of depth. In the best stories, antagonists are given personality, motives, and complexity so that audiences can understand why they do what they do, even if they disagree with them. That makes the final showdown between the hero and the villain more meaningful because both sides feel justified in their own way. In Legends of the Seeker, however, the villains were bad simply because the story demanded it. Dark and Rahi, the central antagonist, was evil without explanation. Why was he harming innocent people? Because he was bad. Why did he reject peace? Because he was bad. There was no nuisance, no psychological deaths, and no attempt to ground his cruelty in anything believable. This one-dimensional approach robbed the story of any real dramatic weight. As a result, audiences struggled to connect with or even care about Dark and Rahi. And while the heroes were relatively written well, a great story is only as strong as its villain. Without a worthy adversary, the stakes collapse. Another major problem was the series' inability to take risks with its narrative. Fantasy stories thrive on unpredictability, the sense that the world is vast, the dangers are real, and the heroes might not always make it out unscathed. In Legends of the Seeker, however, everything felt safe and sanitized. Characters faced threats but never truly changed because of them. Conflicts resolved themselves neatly with no lingering consequences. Viewers were never left shocked, never emotionally gutted, never truly challenged. Instead, it felt like the show was content to recycle the same formula over and over, hoping the audience wouldn't notice. But people did notice, and eventually they stopped caring. Even the attempt at emotional storytelling often rang hollow. Love stories were rushed or poorly targeted, friendships lacked complexity, and the Bond Green characters felt forced instead of organic. The writing failed to give the audience a reason to invest in the characters beyond the surface level. Compare this to other fantasy series such as Game of Thrones, which gave its villains as much complexity as its heroes. Or even Merlin, with balanced episodic adventures with genuine character growth, and it becomes painfully clear how much Legend of the Seeker fell short of its potential. Although Sam Raimi was still in the early stages of his career, it remains difficult to speculate what he might have done differently had he revisited the series later. Would he have trimmed the endless subplots and kept the focus on the central conflict? Will he have reimagined the villains with greater psychological depth? Will he have improved the action sequences and hired a team that understood how to make battles fresh and exciting? These are questions fans have asked for years, and perhaps we will never have clear answers. What we do know now is that Legend of the Seeker squandered an enormous amount of potential. With stronger villains, tighter storytelling, and more inventive action, it could have been a fantasy series for the ages. Instead, it remains an example of how good ideas can falter when the execution fails to grow, adapt, and truly challenge its audience. Legend of the Seeker was more than another fantasy series. It was an ambitious, heartfelt show that managed to combine action, magic, character growth, and emotional resonance into a package that felt fresh in its time and still feels sorely missed today. Cancellation left a void, one that fans have never stopped feeling. And in an era where studios will reboot practically anything, the fact that this show hasn't yet been revisited remains one of the biggest missed opportunities in modern television.